My name is Daryl James. I'm an independent consultant here in Helena, primarily focusing on regulatory, communications, and government affairs services for energy and natural resource development projects across the state. But I also have the honor and the pleasure to serve as the executive director for the Montana Infrastructure Coalition. The Montana Infrastructure Coalition was really born out of a sense of necessity, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the need that we see in infrastructure investment really stems from our historic and our ongoing state of disrepair in our critical infrastructure across the state. So much so that it's garnered a lot of discussion amongst political candidates and policymakers over the last couple of election cycles. So when we think about funding mechanisms and sustainable funding streams, project prioritization, the way that communities address those issues are really going to define how they develop, how competitive they are in the future. It's a conversation that we think is critical as the Infrastructure Coalition. And as you heard Webb mention in his lunchtime talk, infrastructure investment is highlighted as one of the four major objectives in the Chamber's 10-year strategic plan, Envision 2026. Bridger's been trying for over a year to make me say that from the podium, Envision 2026. So there you go, Bridger, you've finally done it. With that, I welcome you to our panel discussion this afternoon, and we're pleased to bring a range of perspectives from three leading experts in infrastructure. First, Jason Williams is the CEO of Blackfoot Telecommunications. Patricia Wise serves as the Deputy Director for the Montana Department of Transportation, and Tim Burton joins us as the Executive Director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns. For the sake of time, I'll defer you to the program to learn more about our panelists' impressive backgrounds and their ongoing contributions to our state. But much like the last panel, I'll start with some background about the Infrastructure Coalition, then we'll hear from Jason about the current state of broadband infrastructure, followed by Pat on the DOT's work, and conclude with Tim's remarks on local government. After our remarks, just like the last panel, we'll have some time for Q&A, and then just allow Bridger to run around with the mic. So real quickly, as most of you are aware, the Infrastructure Coalition, as I said, was really born out of necessity, if not a little bit of frustration with the failure of the administration and the legislature collectively over the 13 and 15 legislative cycles to pass a substantive bonding bill. A number of folks that were vested in that effort, contractors, the chamber, engineers, organized labor, all got together very shortly after the 15 legislative session and said, 2 cycles now, we've failed to impress upon the legislature the importance of significant investment in infrastructure. How do we change that dialogue? How do we make sure that we can get something substantive done next time? So over the course of about 6 months, this group really started to coalesce. And today, the Infrastructure Coalition is made up of over 100 members. Those entities include folks that are involved in the design, the finance, the ownership, operation, maintenance of critical public infrastructure. So we really got together and tried to figure out how to recast the whole dialogue about critical infrastructure investment, the importance of it, the need for sustainability and accountability in how that money is spent. One of our first tasks as a coalition was really to define infrastructure. So as business people in your communities, I'm sure you look around and think about what kind of infrastructure you need to make your business successful. You need connectivity to markets. You need access to trained labor. You need some of those things that the community can provide and some that your neighbors will provide. What we're talking about is those physical pieces of infrastructure: roads, bridges, water, sewer, police and fire protection, schools, hospitals, homes for the elderly care. Those are all pieces of infrastructure, and they are critical to provide the baseline for you and your business and how you invest and where you invest. Our first task then was to say, now if that's all infrastructure, how do we prioritize that? What's the responsibility of state government, and how do we impress again upon the legislature what they need to prioritize? So I'm going to ask you to go back to either high school or undergraduate coursework in sociology and remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How many of you remember Maslow's hierarchy? Good. So at the base of that pyramid was the basic necessities of life, right? Air, water, food, shelter kinds of things. So we took that exhaustive list of infrastructure and said, okay, what does every community across the state have to have before they can have parks and trails or some of those higher things in the pyramid? We decided that critical infrastructure were things like roads, bridges, water, and sewer type projects. Everybody has to have access to markets, safe roads to get our kids to schools, and connectivity to other areas, and a safe and healthy source of water. So that's what we focused on as a coalition in the 17th session. We were certainly successful in passing a fuel tax increase with House Bill 473. Provides a significant influx of revenue for local governments for road and bridge improvements that they have not seen since the mid-'80s, and we had not seen a significant increase in the fuel tax in well over 25 years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk a little bit about broadband infrastructure investment in the state of Montana, and then we'll move down the line and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Cheryl. I appreciate it. I was waiting for you to say broadband as key critical infrastructure components, and that's actually part of my goal today. Is by the end of today, I will impress upon you that when we continue to have these conversations about broadband in the state of Montana, or continue to have these conversations about infrastructure, that broadband is a key component of that. I completely agree with what Daryl said. If you look at the basic building blocks of a community, what do you need for that community to exist? If you do not have access to broadband, your community isn't going anywhere. You don't have the connectivity to the rest of the world like other communities have. So just real quick about Blackfoot. Those of you not familiar with Blackfoot, we are a rural telephone cooperative started in 1954 in Missoula, providing voice services to all the small communities in the far western part of the state. We are headquartered in Missoula, have about 180 employees. We have an office in Bozeman. We have an office in St. Anthony, Idaho, and we have employees working remotely throughout the state of Montana. We really now have two market segments. We still serve about 15,000 rural folks in western Montana, but that's about half of our business. The other half of our business is providing advanced networking services, wide area connectivity to some of Montana's largest businesses, banks, hospitals, hardware stores, many others. Just real quick, this is a map of our network, our core network. We have fiber and fixed wireless assets all over Montana. We have customers in all of the larger cities in Montana and throughout the Pacific Northwest. So why broadband? Broadband as infrastructure. I mean, a lot of it has to do with some of the things I hit on already, but when you think about what broadband has meant to the IT sector over the last 10 or 15 years, that sector of business has completely changed. Broadband enables cloud computing. On the next panel, you have a couple of great Missoula-based businesses, Onyx Maps and Submittable. Their technology only works because if people have access to broadband. Mobile applications. And broadband, access to broadband has fundamentally changed marketing, advertising, a variety of things. Think about the television business today. I'm happy that we're not in it. YouTube gets something like 1 billion views per day. People are watching more than 1 billion views on YouTube per day. Show of hands, does everybody know who owns YouTube, by the way? That would be our friends at Google, so just keep that in mind. Fiber-based broadband is essential to mobile wireless. This is something that I can't say enough, and I think it's understated. We all have these supercomputers in our pockets now, or we have the ability to get them, smartphones, right? And smartphones are only as good until the nearest cell tower they can reach. Because what this device does, when you're going to Facebook and hitting like on that photo of a cat, it's going to the nearest cell tower, but then it's hopping on a broadband network, fiber, that feeds that cell tower, and it's taking it back to the internet where the internet works, and then it's sending you a message back. So it's not right to say that mobile wireless will replace the need for terrestrial broadband. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Our largest customers are T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. And a big part of that is because there's a growing demand and consumption of bandwidth on these devices. And in order to do that, they need connectivity to broadband. So it's companies like Blackfoot and many others that are helping them do that. These are just some statistics as what's happening nationally on the broadband infrastructure scale. In 2016, the U.S., the large wireline, all of Montana's wireline broadband providers, this includes companies like CenturyLink, all of Montana's companies, we invested about $76 billion in broadband infrastructure in 2016. Montana's independent phone companies, there was a study commissioned a little over a year ago that demonstrated Montana's independent companies, companies like Blackfoot, companies like Mid Rivers Telephone, companies like Three Rivers, companies like Triangle Telephone. Since 2011, they have invested $250 million of broadband infrastructure in Montana. In rural areas, Blackfoot's specific plans for broadband network infrastructure investment, we're looking at investing upwards of $75 million is our long-term plan over the next 10 years in just our rural areas. And then in Montana cities, Missoula, Bozeman, the Flathead, and down in Hamilton, we're looking at investing millions more. This year, we invested about $14 million in broadband infrastructure in the state of Montana, Blackfoot did. And for 2018, we have budgeted about $17 million of broadband network infrastructure investment that we're going to be doing in the state. So at the federal level, it's broadband providers have done a good job to get the word broadband in the infrastructure debate. We heard Senator Tester at lunch even mention, water, sewer, broadband, because out in Washington they realize how important broadband connectivity is to the infrastructure issue. Just yesterday, President Trump released his Rural Prosperity Report, and there's a huge component of that talks about rural broadband and how important broadband is for rural America, and how and the Trump administration is going to take the lead in making sure we have connectivity. There was a great op-ed by Sonny Perdue yesterday too, Department of Agriculture, talking about the importance of rural broadband and what it means to rural America. And it's a bipartisan issue. The Democrats, the leadership in the Democratic Congress, they proposed a bill in the middle of the year that I believe allocated up to $20 billion for rural broadband. So there's agreement on both sides of the aisle that funding dedicated for broadband is important. It needs to be part of any infrastructure investments that are going forward. States are doing things. We have extensive operations in Idaho. And the state of Idaho has what's called a state universal service fund, meaning they give state dollars to broadband providers there to invest in broadband in their communities. They're looking at expanding the scope of that, and we're involved in that. Another thing that's happening in a lot of places, which is difficult when you have a budget climate like we do in Montana, but property tax exemptions. Or moratoriums for new broadband investment is important. Broadband's different than roads, for example. When you build a brand new highway, as soon as that highway is done, you can put as many cars on it as possible and fill it. With a broadband network, we spend millions of dollars putting broadband in the ground, then we have to go get customers. And it will take years for us to fill up that broadband pipe. So a tax moratorium or some sort of flexible property tax incentive plan fits with the broadband model better than it does other infrastructure models. So challenges. We have the same construction challenges that everybody else in the infrastructure business has. Big one is our construction season here. We couldn't get our plows in the ground until May this year because of the long winter. And then by mid-July, we had to stop construction at noon because of hoot owl restrictions for fire season, so it made for an incredibly short construction season for us. But a big thing you have in Montana is what I sort of call the donut hole effect. If you have a business in downtown Missoula, downtown Helena, downtown Bozeman, downtown Billings, you probably have a choice for broadband providers, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, and the prices are going to be pretty competitive. If you live way out in the rural areas of Montana, you live out in Scobie, Montana, Fairfield, Montana, down in Wisdom, Montana, you're actually going to get better broadband connectivity down there than you are in Montana cities. And that's just a result of the way the federal subsidy program has worked out over the years. They have earmarked and targeted more subsidies for the very, very rural areas. Well, a lot of us, like me, live in sort of the suburban parts of Montana, places on the fringe of downtown, or maybe in a suburb community, Lolo, Frenchtown, places like that. And that's where internet is really suffering in Montana. There is not good connectivity there. There is not good infrastructure. So that's a big challenge. Capital intensive, just like all the other infrastructure things. I mean, I liken it to sewer and water lines. Fiber optics themselves aren't that expensive, but it's the construction. The construction is where all my costs are, and it's expensive. ROI for broadband networks isn't that good. I mentioned to you earlier, we have to go and make this big investment and then go get customers signed up to put on this network. That's difficult. There's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions lately in the broadband space. CenturyLink has recently acquired Level 3. There's been a lot of other things that have been happening. And when you look at the pure ROI on the amount of money you've spent in the ground, it's not that much. It's barely over 1 times what your investment was, just because of the nature of the business. And that really gets to my final point here, and that's the whole broadband business model. Consumers are demanding lower prices, right? I'm struck that people will spend $4 a day on a cup of coffee, but you charge them more than $100 a month for an internet connection at their home, and they lose their minds, right? I mean, it's kind of funny. But it's true, and we have to be respectful of that. Consumers are expecting broadband to be inexpensive. Okay, I get that. We can do that. Well, where else can I get money from? Well, the largest users of my network pay me nothing. So Netflix, on Blackfoot's network, Netflix makes up 40% of all of our internet traffic. Netflix doesn't pay me a thing for using my network. Facebook and Google, just as an example, those two companies together will have made $100 billion in revenue, or have had $100 billion in revenue in 2017. And they've made their money by selling you advertising, pardon me, or selling people advertising to you over the top of our broadband networks. Google or Facebook pay Blackfoot nothing for using that network. Well, if I can't go get money from the people that are using my network the most, and consumers don't want to pay more, where does that leave me, right? I got nowhere else to go. So that's why the broadband business is tough. And there are some companies in trouble. Some of the larger companies, Frontier Communications is the 4th largest wireline broadband provider in the country, and they've been recently downgraded on Wall Street to junk bonds. Windstream is one of the top 10 largest companies. Same thing. Their debt has been downgraded to junk bonds. So the solution, I don't know what it is, because when you start talking about answers or possible solutions, the policy issues get really complex and really heated in a hurry. But I use a very simple example. My kids go to Paxton Elementary School in Missoula. The local IGA right next to our house, they struck a deal with the elementary school. So if I go in there and I buy my groceries there, I say, give this receipt to Paxton Elementary. So if I spend $100, they give 1% of their sales to the school PTA. Well, think if the largest users of the network, companies like Amazon, companies like Google, companies like Facebook that are making hundreds of billions of dollars and paying it to shareholders, if they instead were to pay a very small percentage of that to put that into a fund that could be used by private entities or public entities that could be used for broadband investment, think what we could do with that money. And the irony is, by making that small investment, we could connect more people to the internet, so those companies would actually make more money, right? Because they could sell more goods and services because there would be that many more people connected to the internet. So in my mind, there is some answers out there, but again, when you start weighing into the policy issues, there's I'm just going to say it because somebody else is going to say it, but there's this little thing called net neutrality floating out there you may have heard of that's become a political issue that a lot of people don't have a deep understanding of, myself included. But I would argue that these really complicated policy issues are a unique challenge talking to broadband providers when it comes to broadband infrastructure that necessarily the other infrastructure providers don't have. So in closing, I hope I impressed on you the need to consider broadband in the infrastructure discussion. Really want to leave you with the idea that broadband, mobile wireless networks and wireline broadband networks are really one and the same network. You can't have one without the other. I enjoyed speaking with you, and I welcome the opportunity for questions at the end of the panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. And I want to point out that in my Maslow's hierarchy, I had included broadly communications kind of at the base of the pyramid, but I included fiber optic near the top of the pyramid. I was schooled by a number of your colleagues, Jason, on the flawed thinking there and the importance of access to fiber in rural Montana and how critical it is to growing businesses in these more remote areas. So thank you for your comments. You know, I'd mentioned House Bill 473 and the fuel tax increase, so we welcome Pat Wise from the Department of Transportation to talk a little bit about what that means and what it helps accomplish and maybe what's still left to be done with regard to funding for our critical road and bridge needs across the state. Please welcome Pat Wise.
Thanks, Daryl. And thanks to Webb for inviting me to this meeting today, and Bridger, to you. It was good to see you. You were at one of our more intense, I think, Transportation Commission meetings not too long ago about roundabout. So glad to be here. Bridger had asked me real quickly to just talk about who I am and what I do. I think it's always curiosity for people from the private sector wondering what in the heck does a deputy director do? Well, I am the chief of staff essentially for 9 divisions, 5 districts, and 200 plus employees in the organization, and I have other duties as assigned, which recently has been buffalo foot traffic in West Yellowstone and the disposition of historic aeronautic beacons in the state. So glad to be here today and talk to probably something that's very core to transportation and to your heart as well, infrastructure improvement in the state. First, I'd like to talk about recent initiatives, and first like to talk about the collaboration with the Chamber and other partners during the last legislative session that, as Daryl said, resulted in the passage of House Bill 473, the Bridge and Road Safety and Accountability Act. But just real quickly as an aside, I think just as important or as important to the passage of that legislation was your promotion, as well as a number of other private partners' promotion of Montana's infrastructure is one of the key strategic objectives in Envision 2026, which is your plan for sustained economic growth in the state. Sound transportation investment, infrastructure investment, it's complex, it's complicated, sometimes it's confusing, and it's always time-consuming. And I think I've used most of the C words that I could think of. But it's also critical, it's also vital to the overall health of the state's economy. So thank you for your long-term interest and commitment in this strategic objective. So back to one of my favorite acronyms, BRSA. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about an update on that piece of legislation. Key points, just as a reminder, it creates an account for bridge and road safety and accountability that's effective, or was effective, July 1 of 2017. Funding can only be used for bridge and road projects. The revenue stream for the account is from an increase in the motor fuels tax, gas incremental increase of 6 cents a gallon by 2023, and diesel incremental increases of 2 cents a gallon through 2023. The revenue is split between the Montana Department of Transportation, and that split is the greater of 35% and $9.8 million, and local governments, which is then up to the remaining 65% of that split. The increase will provide Montana Department of Transportation sufficient cash flow to sustain the match for federal aid construction projects. This was in jeopardy prior to the 2017 session. We weren't sure that we would be able to construct all of our projects that we had on our list, and so this at least will allow us to exclusively to use these funds to match federal aid projects. The increase does not provide sufficient funding for long-term MDT outside of those match restrictions, but it does provide a key role in making those match money available, because Montana is one of the states that has a tremendous state match to federal ratio. It's about 82 cents, 85 cents to 15 to 17 cents on the dollar. So pretty significant match, and thank you very much for every one of you in this room that helped with that piece of legislation. The increase for local governments, that 65%, will be used for road and bridge construction, reconstruction, and maintenance. There are some requirements in House Bill 473 that include Montana must maintain a website listing all projects funded through the account. That website will be up and running in June of this year. The timing on that is good because we will not make the first payout to those local governments until March of 2018. And so we'll need some time to finalize what those numbers look like, get the website up and in gear and available to you to view. So that's our time frame on that. Legislative Audit Division must conduct a performance audit of the department by 6/30 of 2018 with an update in 6/30 of 2019. And again, those auditors are in the building right now. We see a lot of the legislative auditors at the Department of Transportation because we're such a large organization. We've got a little space for them down in admin. We've made them cozy, make sure the heat's on down there. And we're looking forward to this performance audit, as I'm sure all of you are. Nothing to hide, and all that we can do is look forward to finding improvements based on that audit. So local funds, the local portion of each calendar year's collections are allocated to local governments, again, as I said, on March 1st of 2017 or of the following year. Each local government's share of the revenue is based on the same statutory formula as the quote-unquote older gas tax allocations that are in 1570-103 in the MCA. So exact same formula. So there are no surprises there. And a local match of $1 is required for every $20. The local request process, we as the state pass-through on this have been working very hard to make sure that we define this request process as just that, as opposed to an application process. We've worked collaboratively with the League of Cities and Towns, with MACO, to draft local guidance, administrative rules, and the request process, and that is all in place now for local governments. We are glad to provide training to locals on, we're using web grants, which is a state grant application request process that's already in place, and are glad to provide trainings to folks that are interested in learning more about how to access that website process. Again, the first opportunity to request distribution of the funds is March of 2018. And we are asking that any questions about this process be referred either to MACO or the League of Cities and Towns for guidance and questions. But we can provide an MDT contact for that as well. And I can just give you that right now. It's Kathy Callan CALLON, and her extension is, for those of you outside the Helena system, 444-7294. So please, with questions. We want this to be as transparent and as accessible as possible for all of you and your constituents who are using this new system. And if for whatever reason you're having questions, like I say, the League and MACO have been good about working with us through this process, and please give us a call as well if you've got questions. Revenue forecast, just to give you an idea of the dollars that we're looking at, projected revenue for fiscal year 2018 looks to be $29 million. In 2018, MDT will then retain $12.5 million of new revenue, and after that, MDT will retain the greater of either 9.8 million or that 35% that I talked about earlier. New revenue is subject to refunds, distributor collection fees, tribal revenue sharing, and off-road allocations that are a part of that old formula process that constituents are familiar with. There is a 2-month delay between when taxes are assessed and when taxes are collected, just to remind you of that. So if it feels like there's a little bit of a lag time, that's what that 2 months is. The first allocation to local governments is projected to be about $6.2 million, and it again is allocated on the same formula as that old process. So there's what we know about House Bill 473. We're very excited about having the legislation passed, and it's just the start of then seeing both at a state and a local level some additional resources being translated into, hopefully, infrastructure improvements in the state. I'd like to talk just real quickly about a couple of other initiatives that we've got going at MDT. The first one being Vision Montana. Or Vision Zero, excuse me. And we know that for the second time in 2 years, fatalities and serious injuries in the state have declined. Knock on whatever kind of wood surface you can find. We've had a conversation with the Highway Patrol about what may be a part of seeing those numbers decline. And it's hard to pinpoint one particular thing. It could be because consumers are getting smarter about belting up. They're getting smarter about, particularly in the weather that we've seen in the last month and a half, slowing down. So thank you for that. Tell your kids, tell your parents, whoever else you can talk to about this, that those are key components to reducing fatal injuries and deaths in the state. There's some technology advances that have helped to some degree. The rumble strips that some of you may be either cussing or discussing in the last year and a half or so have really helped make sure that distracted drivers, particularly sleepy drivers, are, when they hear that rumble strip on the outer edge particularly, are getting back off the shoulder and onto the roadways. We've seen the Highway Patrol pick up enforcement on some areas of the state. They're spread pretty thin, but more active presence on the roads do help with that. There's some intangibles that may have involved anything from fire season last year, driving down tourist numbers in the state, to those other kind of economic drivers that we can get some anecdotal sense of, but we really can't measure the impacts of. But for whatever reason, those numbers are down. We know, what we do know at the Department of Transportation is that even one fatality is too much, so we are continue to be committed to that Vision Zero. Third initiative is the passage of another piece of legislation. This is the third time around for our CMGC legislation. What that is, and I love acronyms as well as the next person, but I don't know that this is a very descriptive extender of that. Construction Manager General Contractor is what CMGC stands for. And it really is a unique method that we are going to use to accelerate the project delivery process for state construction projects, and to provide an integrated approach to planning, design, and construction. Owners, Montana Department of Transportation usually, but local partners where they're the owners of roadways, designers and contractors will work collaboratively to develop the project scope, optimize design, improve quality, manage costs, and share the risks of those projects. This method will also allow access to federal construction dollars to be secured a little bit earlier in project. And we know that this process is not meant to be a fix-all or to replace the department's traditional design bid build or design build processes. But on complex projects, CMGC does give MDT an additional tool to get work done more effectively. And for the contractors in the room, thank you again for your partnership in seeing that pass. I think we've got a good tool there. Our pilot project is going to be a bridge over the Clark Fork River at Trout Creek. And the general intent of the project is to replace the deck on the structure due to its deteriorating condition. That may not sound like a terribly complex project, but when you talk about having to widen and narrow access onto this old bridge frame and to get across a number of different kind of complex water structures that are right there at that bridge, I think it's a perfect candidate for CMGC, and we're really looking forward to seeing how the pilot turns out. How am I doing for time?
You're good.
Am I good? Okay. Okay. Finally, Bridger asked me to talk a little bit about MDT's project prioritization process, and by extension, I'm assuming that you'd like to hear a little bit about where in that prioritization process the public has the opportunity for input. And I know that people's interest on transportation projects is most often focused on either a specific issue or a specific project that all of a sudden you may see a grader out in front of your house and you're going, I didn't realize we were expanding the road to 12-foot shoulders and, you know, three lanes of transportation. So appreciating that, just would like to continue to try to educate, particularly groups like this, that Montana does rely on an established planning practice and a number of statutes to guide its transportation system decision-making processes, and that on many different levels in that project development, there are places for public input. So I thought it would be helpful to run through what those mechanisms are and where the public input kind of pressure points are. So first, there's TranPlan Montana. And TranPlan Montana is the department's overarching guide to our long-range, and this is multimodal transportation policy planning. So we're talking about not only highway structures, but public transportation, rail, multimodal foot and bicycle paths are all included in our TranPlan Montana plan. The TranPlan Montana plan, I hate to continue to say that doubly, but it establishes broad policy goals and strategies that guides MDT in its decision making. It's not project specific, but if you want to engage in this part of our planning process, which is a federally mandated 20-year plan, here's your chance to engage on a policy level. We do renew this plan more often than every 20 years, and mostly the impetus for those changes are a new federal highway plan. The TranPlan Montana nationally, almost 2 years ago, initiated a TranPlan Montana review in the state. So we just finished that. It's available on our website. Public input was fairly substantial. We had a lot of Montanans that weighed in through an online survey. We had a number of stakeholder meetings. Some of you in this room were involved in those, and press conferences engaged in that level. We did one-on-one interviews with both stakeholders and the general public. Our metropolitan planning organizations, which we have 3 of in Montana, Great Falls, Missoula, and Billings, had a special role in looking at policy development in this area. And you could comment directly as the public by looking on the website and making specific comments to that website as well. So we were pretty pleased with the engagement of the public in this process. And I think that that is a level of stakeholder and public engagement that will help educate long-term what transportation policy is about. A lot of folks think it's pretty dry stuff. The engineers and planners that I work with don't, but if you've got other things in your life, it's nice to be able to go to a particular particular source and look at that policy development. In addition to TransPlan Montana, we do biennial customer and stakeholder surveys. We contract with the University of Montana School of Business on odd numbers to conduct this random and it's statistically valid statewide survey of the public to examine the public perceptions of the quality of the state highway transportation and intermodal transportation systems. So again, it's not just the what is the actual quality, but what does the public think about that quality? We've gotten some good information about this. Use this biennial survey data in developing our shorter-term conversations with local county and city transportation planning organizations, legislators, county commissioners, those groups. It's a good source of information for us. The next document that it's an acronym that if you're a mathematician, it probably sounds a little better. It's Performance Programming, the Performance Programming Process, or P3 process. And this is a decision-making tool that we utilize that is data-driven, and the intent of this is to really give us the best information possible about the conditions of our roadways and as well public interest in priorities for improvement to that process. It's an engaged process. The last time I think I spent any time, or we did, describing P3 was at an interim committee of the legislature, and it took us about 2 days to walk through it. I have made available, because I don't have a slide presentation, the 2016 fact book for the Montana Department of Transportation that's available out here on the table. And it's got details on all of these pressure points for input and what they look like. So please pick one of these up. They're a wealth of information, and then I won't have to talk in little tiny 9-point font print for you. So appreciate that. Performance programming process, please keep that in mind, because particularly at that local level, this is the information that we use when our district administrators from those 5 districts that I talked to you about, where they're really communicating data on the condition of roads to the 19 urban planning districts that we have, urban planning groups that we have around the state, plus our county commissions and legislators. So if you want to get engaged early, my reference is always vote early, vote often. This is a good place to do that. Get engaged by getting yourself on stakeholders' mailing lists, on paying attention to announcements about transportation planning that may come from your county or city organization, or public meeting notices that the Montana Department of Transportation puts out that tell you when we're going to have meetings that have to do with a very specific project. Again, it's harder and harder to make changes in a very complex process the further along you are in that process. So I would ask you again to look to those opportunities to engage with your local transportation planners and also with our district organization. But you can always give us a call, and the director or I or any of our administrators that deal with this work would be more than glad to visit with you about what your transportation plan looks like. So thank you for the time, and again, complex, time-consuming, but we're glad to spend the time with any of you as a reference on that if we can. Thanks.
Pat, thank you very much for that overview of MDT. You know, one of the things that made the discussion about a fuel tax increase a little bit more palatable to the Montana voter and to the legislators was the notion that we've got 200 million visitors to the state of Montana every year who pay virtually no other user fee for their impact on our infrastructure. When we think about other local infrastructure projects like water sewer type projects, talking about raising rates and fees on Montana's already overtaxed taxpayer becomes much more difficult. So I'm hoping that Tim's remarks will address some of those concerns of local governments and how we're funding some of those pieces of critical infrastructure, not just in communities like Helena, but in some of our small rural communities across the state. Tim Burton.
Thank you, Daryl. As Daryl said, my name's Tim Burton. I'm the executive director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, which is an 87-year-old association. There are 49 state leagues throughout the country. Hawaii does not have a state league because they don't allow municipal corporations to form, so they only have counties. Many years ago, the state leagues got together, and we also created the National League of Cities. And the state directors have a special place in running that organization because we created it. I think that there are a lot of challenges and opportunities in the arena of infrastructure financing and management. I've spent a career managing counties and cities and managing positions within the state of Montana, so I've been in the infrastructure business for 30 plus years, and it has changed dramatically. I remember the days as a city manager going back to DC, and Senator Baucus was on the powerful Finance and Claims Committee, and Conrad Burns was on the Appropriations Committee, and we would go back there with our needs, particularly on highway infrastructure, water and sewer projects, and that's the way they were financed. And you'd go in and visit with your senator and say, look, here's what we need this year, Senator. Here's what you did for us last year, and here's how we produced the results. Here's what we need going forward. They would go back to their committee. The committee would make sure that what happened a year before was performed upon, and then you'd come home with money. And we would participate in the state programs, but they were very unimportant at that time because the real money for infrastructure investment came from the federal government. That's been gone for at least a decade. Earmarks are gone, and the federal government really has not been participating to any great degree at the state level, and practically to no degree at the local level with cities and counties, and that's quite a challenge. The state, we've got our regular programs in terms of the Treasure State Endowment Program. It's now capped. We operate sewer and water, stormwater, and bridge projects out of that fund, but it's not going to grow. We also have rural water and state revolving funds, which are loan funds. They're low interest loan funds, but our residents have to pay those debts back. There are no new infrastructure programs on the horizon. The state, as Daryl mentioned, hasn't passed a bonding program in at least the last 3 sessions. That used to be a matter of course. The state legislature would convene. The most senior Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate would always want to carry the bonding bill, and that went away with partisan politics and other issues, because it certainly hasn't been the state's position to finance the bonding program. The state has virtually zero debt. And to put it into perspective, in the last session, we were arguing over a $80 to $100 million bonding program, and we couldn't get it across the floor. Bozeman, the city of Bozeman, passed a $120 million bond for their schools. Great Falls passed a $95 million bond for their schools. Helena passed a $70 million bond for their schools. So the state has chosen to really stay with just their existing programs and get out of the infrastructure business, at least for the short term. At the local level, there's been clearly an over-reliance on property tax, and that trend has been taking place for at least 4 decades. We have looked at our property tax base from the 70s forward, and we've been exempting property the entire 40 years to where our tax base is just a fraction of what it was 40 years ago. And understand that local government does not rely on any income tax or any sales tax to fund our operations. And I think it's also important to note that not only cities, but also counties and your schools are funded off of that same shrinking tax base. To the point where, and I just mentioned a bunch of bonds that were passed, but a lot of bonds are being turned down because property ratepayers are saying, hey, you know, we've kind of had enough. We get the cost shift from the federal and the state government, and it all falls on the property taxpayer. And in addition to that, we have created more special districts to fund infrastructure, whether they're road maintenance districts or park maintenance districts or any number of stormwater maintenance districts. And all of those fees go right onto the residential property ratepayer too. So we've got one source of funding. We've got a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deficit in Montana, and that is in part and parcel part of the challenge that we're facing. So as Darrell mentioned, I think it was about 2.5 years ago, and I have to mention the Montana Chamber and Vision 2026, right? Is that good? It was after the 15 legislative session, the Chamber came over to see us and said, hey, let's create an infrastructure coalition to better represent the problem and to try to find solutions collectively. And if you think of the fact that you've got 56 counties, 128 cities, and we work close together, and through the coalition, and I'm fortunate to sit on the board of the Infrastructure Coalition, you include the contractors, the architects, the engineers, the AFL-CIO, all of the other players that are involved in building and maintaining infrastructure systems. And it's been a real effective organization that made all the difference in the last legislative session. I got to tell you that to be able, for the first time in 3 decades, raise the gas tax in the last legislative session when they were virtually just cutting across the board tens and hundreds of millions of dollars was quite an accomplishment, and I think it speaks volumes. But the key to that was we also did our homework. We approached the problem, and I think it's a pretty simple problem-solving model, and it's simpler than it really is in practice, but you identify the problem, you define the problem, you review your options, you select and implement the option, and then you monitor and adjust. And that's really what we did with the gas tax discussion. We have tremendous research resources in Terry Johnson and Lois Steinbeck that probably between the two of them have over 70 years experience doing research at the state level and financial research. So we knew as well as anybody what the problem was at both the state level, our ability to fully fund the federal highway program and bring all that money into Montana, maintain our secondary program, and at the city and the county level, we knew full well that our rates or our gas tax distributions had remained the same for over 30 years with 0% growth. 30 years ago, we distributed $16.7 million between cities and counties. Last year, we distributed $16.7 million between cities and counties. And it's a wonder that we're not keeping up with that infrastructure system. Now, you can look at water and wastewater and stormwater across the board, and the story's going to be the same. I'll tell you that it's critical that we know what we own, that we know what condition it's in. It's tied to viable capital improvement programs, and that you have a way, particularly with cities who build and maintain more infrastructure than any other form of government, that if you're going to have a limited resource, then you know, because you know what you own and what condition it's in, that that money will do the best good in the water department or in the wastewater department or in your street and road system. I would tell you that relative to our research, we started with the ASCE report card, the architects and engineers, which ranked the condition of our infrastructure across Montana and the nation. The National League of Cities has also been a tremendous resource on infrastructure and our ability to convey what the real story is relative to the deficit and the fact that we're letting our infrastructure across the board fall apart in this country and in this state. I mean, all you got to do is fly cross country and look at the level of our airports from Seattle to Washington, D.C. anymore, and it's, in many cases, somewhat embarrassing. So we were able to get across the line with the gas tax discussion. And I'll tell you, since that time, a year ago, you could practically go nowhere in Montana without hearing about the infrastructure deficit and the fact that we need to invest into our infrastructure systems to really create the climate where private business will invest and will create jobs. But that narrative has completely changed in just a year's time. Now we're talking about the fact that the state's tax collections are down, unemployment is practically non-existent, the economy is growing, and our tax system's not keeping pace with that type of growth. It's going to be the issue that we'll be dealing with for the next 2 to 4 years, is how do we restructure a tax system to capture the new economy, recognizing that the natural resource economy is changing and not necessarily for the good if what you're talking about is revenue. I will tell you too that the challenge at the state level is pretty large as well. I just got an email from the league, National League here, and for nearly every community in the country, closing America's $2 trillion infrastructure gap. So on a national basis within the cities, that's what we're talking about. But I'll also say that we're putting together a concerted effort at the National League, and I'm very fortunate to sit on that board of directors and on their legislative committee. And we are putting together our program to deal with Congress and the executive branch to address critical improvements to our transportation systems, water infrastructure, and broadband networks. I had to get that in. And so with that, you'll see a coordinated, concerted effort at the national level. But also between the cities, the counties, and the coalition, you're going to continue to see us further define the problem. And we're not going to walk away from the problem because status quo is not okay. You need fire protection, you need Main Street. Businesses need infrastructure to conduct business. And so with that, I'll stop there. I think we've got a few minutes left. And appreciate your time today. Thanks.
So, thank you very much to our panel. Just thinking about recent articles that I've read, I read something yesterday that said the Trump administration is using about $1 trillion infrastructure deficit. The plan as of yesterday was for the administration to come up with about $200 billion in federal funding to address that gap, look at significant regulatory reform, but the rest of that gap is going to be filled by local taxpayers. Tim?
Yeah, I'd also like to add to that, Daryl, that, and I'm not here to support or not support the recent tax cut at the federal level, but that's going to add $1.5 trillion by all estimates that I read to the federal deficit. The comment today was that they're looking at putting together $1 trillion infrastructure program, which is going to be just that much harder to get across the finish line because of what we did last week in terms of adding another $1.5 trillion to the debt. So that doesn't lessen the challenge, in my opinion, relative to investing into our aging, deteriorating infrastructure systems.
So I bring that up to say that the coalition's work is not done, the chamber's work is not done when we start thinking about infrastructure investment, and not just the hard buried infrastructure, but certainly the things that connect our economies across the state. So with that, Phil Donahue will run around with the mic and take questions for the panel.
Any questions? Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Sheila Rice with the Montana Housing Coalition. So you won't be surprised that I'm going to talk a little bit about homes and apartments. I'm with you, Jason. I want to get housing on that list. That's infrastructure. And you did mention housing in your initial remarks, Daryl, so I appreciate that. But I have a question specific for Tim. My example is that we're building a $20 million, 124-unit apartment complex in Great Falls. And of that, $2.5 million is infrastructure. Just to get, and this is right adjacent to the city limits of Great Falls. And at least in Great Falls, the developer carries 100% of that burden. So that's $20,000 per unit that we have to put in just to get services and roads, et cetera, to that. So my question, Tim, is how can we work with the Infrastructure Coalition to help cities understand the value of their contributions? We could build 15 more units if we didn't have that piece in a very critical needed area in Great Falls if we didn't have that infrastructure. So I just want your advice on how to bring the cities in on, we're part of infrastructure for new homes as well.
Well, it's a difficult issue. Infrastructure is expensive. But I'll tell you that sewer and water systems, stormwater drainage systems, fire hydrants, and that level of infrastructure is more sustainable than what we do with exempt wells and septic tanks. For example, you look out at the fairgrounds in that Woodlawn Dunbar neighborhood of about 25 or 30 houses, all the septic tanks had failed and their wells were contaminated, so they hooked into the city sewer and water system, which was their only option. That was in the days when we had federal and state grant monies available to assist them. And it was about $35,000 a house to retrofit those, which would have been cheaper had we done it the other way up front. So the programs in terms of CDBG, the home program to subsidize those types of developments haven't grown and have been cut. Again, the federal government is not in financing these type of improvements, particularly that affect affordable housing at the level that they used to be. The state programs are drying up, and at the same time, the cost of infrastructure has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades. So my advice is that we need to get the federal and state government back into the business, and it's not all the same, but particularly on the development of affordable housing. The way that those subsidies have evaporated means that you do less with less. And so I don't know that there's any magic answer except that it's going to take more resources at all levels of government to be back into a program where we were, let's say, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
Very good. Any other questions? Let's pick here.
I was really very excited to hear broadband because I've been one of the people on the coalition that's been pushing for that. Are you going to focus on that in the next session? We know that it's a focus of the federal government, and Senator Tester spoke about it today too. Sarah Converse with Sweetgrass Development.
So I'm going to redirect the question, Sarah, and ask Jason, what can the coalition do to help foster better infrastructure development from a broadband perspective?
You know, there was, in a couple of sessions ago, it was House Bill 14, I think. Well, let me take a step back. The Main Street Montana KIN, there was a broadband infrastructure KIN that was put together. They've actually issued the report as to what can be done. And one of the recommendations calls for a public-private partnership. And that was actually teed up a couple of sessions ago in House Bill 14, where how it worked was there was some funds set aside, and cities or counties would identify specific areas. Okay, this part of our county lacks broadband, this part of our community lacks broadband, and what the community could do then, or the city or town would apply for a grant. And if they were to get $500,000 from the state, then they would have to go find a private provider like Blackfoot, where we would come in and we would contribute $500,000 of our own dollars. So together we'd have $1 million to build broadband in a portion of a community at where the community wanted us to build it. In my mind, that's a really good solution because it puts the sort of the voice in the communities where they think they need broadband the most. Now, what that means in the next session is a revenue ask, which, get in line, right?
Exactly.
But I think that really is a really good model. It's just a matter of coming up with the funding to make it happen.
Very good. Any other questions? I've got one for Pat then. So Pat, when we look at the impact of House Bill 473, something like $20 million in additional revenue to the department, that certainly helps leverage the federal highway dollars that are currently available. The Trump administration had talked early on about a potential increase in the federal gas tax to increase federal funding availability. What happens if that goes into place? What happens if there's additional revenue available from the feds under 473?
We panic in a cheerful way. No, Daryl, I think that's a really good question because we can just match what our formula funds from the federal government are looking at this point, and it's an exciting conundrum to think about that much additional federal money being available and having to match at some dollar value what those numbers are. And it's a point of discussion and to be continued. So thanks for the question.
So it really is a short-term fix, and we can't wait another 25 years to address this issue again, probably.
It looks like from our best estimations and being conservative with the funding levels at the state level that we've got now, that we can probably go another 6 to 7 years, and then we'll have to have that conversation again. So no, we can't afford another 20-year hiatus.
Very good. All right. Thank you again very much for our panelists. Join me.